The music of drums, flutes, tambourines and jingle bells filled the throne room. Dozens upon dozens of scantily clad dancing girls moved and swayed in rhythm to the tune of the song. Their brightly colored silken scarves that they held in their hands swirled like a rainbow caught in the wind. The aged and albino sultan sat on his elevated ivory throne and looked down on his convulsing harem with quiet admiration. He found himself humming along to the tune that his minstrels were playing. The name of the song was Ria al-Jini al-Baria, meaning the winds of the wild jinn. The tune was a wild and passionate one that slowly built up to a tremendous crescendo that left the listener with a feeling of breathless excitement. When the music was over, the sultan gleefully clapped his stubby little hands like a child and commanded his entertainers to play the song again. The musicians bowed their turban-clad heads and began to play the song for the 100th time that day. The sultan then commanded his many wives, lovers and concubines to resume their dancing. The women, always eager to please and gain favor from their master, obeyed. The sultan sighed as he watched the tallest of the dancers swaying to and fro. Her name was Lillian. She was the one dressed in brightest green. Her hair was long and black and tied back into a single braid that whipped around her like a striking snake. She wore bells on her garments that seemed to sing like choirs of angels to the sultan's ears. He was genuinely considering making her his head wife. This was a serious issue for the old man to deal with. His old head wife, Al-Jaria, had been the love of his life. But she had also broken his poor heart when she died giving birth to his only child, a daughter named Alina. When she had died, the sultan had openly declared that he would never have a head wife again in order to keep her memory sacred. But that had been 27 years ago, and Lillian was so very beautiful. She looked strong and healthy, able to give him sons, heirs. True, Alina was technically his heir apparent, but he knew that she wouldn't be able to rule his city. Although she was his daughter and he loved her dearly, she was still a silly, empty-headed woman. It was a well-known fact throughout the endless sands that women were incapable of rational or logical thought and were prone to wild hysterics. He would need a son to ensure that his dynasty would last. Only a male heir would keep his realm powerful and strong. Lillian would give him that son, or perhaps sons, if the jinn were willing. The sultan sighed as he gazed down at her, her graceful form flowing in perfect rhythm to the beat of the music. She glanced up at him and their eyes met. She smiled at him, her large eyes were like deep wells of water and moonlight. The sultan's beady red eyes widened and he smiled wickedly back at her. She smiled and lowered her gaze in submission and continued her dance. Yes, the sultan thought as he watched her, you will be my head wife. You will give me a son. The high double doors burst open and the Grand Vizier, Asad al-Armen, rushed in. He was a tall thin man with deathly pale grey skin, a long hooked nose, small eyes and a long thin well-groomed moustache and goatee that drooped down past his chest. He wore tight-fitting black robes that were trimmed with crimson and a white turban that had a single peacock feather sticking out of it. He ran through the startled dancing girls and flung himself face down before the sultan. 10,000 pardons and apologizes for intruding on you, my lord, cried the vizier. May it please your majesty for your servant to rise so that he may give you his message. What is it, you miserable dog? Growled the old man, thoroughly annoyed at having his entertainment disrupted. The Sulian lieutenant, the rude one who dared to insult you in your own throne room, said the Grand Vizier. He is coming here. What for? The sultan grumbled. To learn how our preparations for the southern campaign are progressing. That Sulian son of a goat dares to interrupt my leisure to demand to know how I run my army. The old sultan thought as he looked down from his throne. For that I will have my fun with him. How long until he arrives? The sultan asked. Mere moments, your highness, answered Asad. He is directly behind me. And I was having such a lovely day, sighed the sultan as he gazed down at his beautiful Lillian, who blushed and looked away with a shy giggle. The sultan smiled and looked back at Asad. Prepare to receive our most noble guest, he said as he rose to his feet. The dancing girls rushed to the sides of the room, leaving the polished tile floor empty. They placed their silken veils over their faces since only the sultan was permitted to see them unveiled. They reclined on enormous red cushions and made themselves comfortable. While they did this, Asad called for the sultan's personal bodyguards to take their places within the throne room. The big men tramped in. They were members of the Jumada. Each one had been selected from the very best of the sultan's army. Each of them had proven their loyalty to the sultan and to Kazmorian time and time again before entering the Jumada. In order to gain entry into such an illustrious order, they had been required to perform a deed that many had deemed impossible, killing an Arthurian in battle. Many had tried and all but a few had failed. The Jamaida were both hated and feared by the tribes of Arthuria, who called them, among other things, Hogzageraaf Kazmorian, the headhunters of Kazmorian. The only way to kill the immortal Arthurians was by chopping off their heads. The headquarters of the Jamaida was infamous for the collection of skulls on display within its courtyard. Each skull was the prized trophy of a newly inducted member. There were about 24 Jamaida within the throne room. Each was clad in a silken green shirt over which a coat of plaited mail was worn. They had white sashes wrapped around their middles and their heads were topped with a spiked Kula Kud helmet. They were all armed with domed metal shields, curved swords and long spears. They took their positions along the walls of the throne room and made themselves look as impressive and as intimidating as possible. Moments later, the Sulian lieutenant entered the room, along with the ensign and the marines. The lieutenant stood as straight as a ramrod with his hands clasped behind his back. He looked up at the aged sultan sitting on his throne. "Your Majesty," he said, "I hope you don't mind my coming here unannounced, but I was eager to learn how your preparations are going. How is your army getting along?" "My army is mobilizing as we speak," lied the sultan, "but, alas, I fear that it may take some days or even a few weeks to fully muster." The sultan saw that this annoyed the Sulian and that made him feel good. "Unacceptable," said the lieutenant curtly, "my quarry will have doubtlessly fled the region by that time. You must gather your troops faster. I am marshalling my forces as fast as is humanly possible, O great and noble son of Sulia," said the sultan, "but you must understand that my realm stretches far and wide. We are not as advanced as you and your people. We do not have such things as radios, telegraphs or telephones that allow men to speak over many miles." This was a bold-faced lie. The Sultanate of Kazmorian was actually one of the few powers within the Endless Sands to possess such technologies due to its connections to the Sulian Empire. Not only did it have modern communications, but it also had a railroad connecting the Memnet oil fields to the city of Tar-Fa, a city that had an aerodrome as well. "And what is more," continued the Sultan, "my army must travel on foot, on horseback or by camel to get here. You must understand that it takes a very long time for anyone to cross the desert." The Sultan chuckled on the inside at the cleverness of his lies. It was clever because it was true. It did take many days to cross the arid dunes. The Sulian lieutenant glared hard up at the withered old husk of a man, his eyes burning like glowing coals. He clasped his gloved hands behind his back, the leather creaking as he tightened his hold. His anger was rising up inside of him. He could feel it broiling like a pot of water over a fire. The old wretch was lying to him, he was certain of this. He had been lied to so many times before back in Empire City that he could tell when a person was speaking truthfully or not. His peers had always hated him due to his status as a half-breed and had conspired and contrived to thwart his ambitions for power. They had gone out of their way to ensure that he was denied recognition for his duties, which he performed with utter devotion. He had had to fight for every last ounce of respect he had gained from his commanding officers. He knew that his climb to the top would be a long and arduous one, doing double the work and only getting half of the credit. "But I'll get there," he thought as he glared up at the old sultan. "One day, I'll be the most powerful man in the empire." That day, however, if it ever came at all, hadn't come yet. The lieutenant took a step forwards and cleared his throat. He knew that the sultan was playing with him. Very well, he would play along with this little game. It was time to expose the cracks in the sultan's facade. "So what you are telling me is that you have no soldiers in Kazmorian ready to march?" he asked. "Unfortunately you speak the truth," replied the sultan with a smug grin. "Cheeky little sand swine," thought the lieutenant. "That is very unfortunate news," he said, "very unfortunate indeed." "Yes it is," agreed the sultan. "Well, sir, if that is true," said the lieutenant, turning to one of the nearest Jamaida, "then who are these men?" The sultan's smug smile instantly vanished. "They look like fine soldiers to me," continued the lieutenant, marching up to one and giving him a thorough inspection. "These are my personal bodyguards," replied the sultan. "Their sole purpose in life is to protect my person and my honor. They rarely go beyond the palace's walls and are not expected to fight on the battlefield. Surely your own emperor's bodyguards are the same." "Oh, on the contrary, sir," replied the lieutenant, "our emperor can only be protected by men who have shown their prowess in the heat of battle. It is a great honor to guard the holy city of Seoul, but it is not the only duty that is required. When the empire is at war, the imperial bodyguard will often be deployed to the front to show that they are truly the best of the best. It has been our law and our custom stretching far back into hallowed antiquity during the days of the First Empire. Surely, Your Highness, you must see the wisdom in this logic. The Sultan said nothing, drumming his fingers on the arm of his throne. The current Imperial Bodyguard Regiment, the 699th Armored Grenadiers, which I believe numbers around 10,000 men or so, could easily be called up and transported to Kazmorian in less than 3 days. The lieutenant smiled under his gas mask as he saw the concern flash across the old man's face. The thought of having thousands of Sulians tramping through his city genuinely alarmed him. It was bad enough having the giant battleship, Hilba, bobbing in his harbor. Her gigantic cannons were leveled at his city, cannons which could annihilate Kazmorian in less than 5 minutes if the Sulians so desired. But if this smug little Suli really had the clout to have the 699th moved here, which he didn't in actuality, then it would mean chaos for Kazmorian. That will not be necessary, said the Sultan. But, Your Highness, said the lieutenant in mock surprise, I thought you said that you didn't have any soldiers ready to march south. And that is true, replied the Sultan, from a certain point of view. What do you mean? Asked the lieutenant. What I meant was that I had no professional soldiers, explained the Sultan. There are many bands of nomads who could be sent south while my army prepares here. Who are these nomads? Asked the lieutenant. Cutthroats, thieves and murderers all, laughed the Sultan. They are as ignorant and stupid as they are ruthless and savage. You may think them vile and contemptible, which indeed they are. But I will swear by my faith that they are unrivaled when it comes to speed and horsemanship. It is their kind who have the biggest grudge against the interloping Arthurians, and it is their kind who have the most experience fighting them. If that is so, then why haven't you called them up? Asked the lieutenant, growing annoyed at this game they were playing. Your ignorance of the ways of the Endless Sands is showing, my friend, said the Sultan with a smile and a wag of his finger. The lieutenant sneered at the man from under his gas mask. I haven't called them up, as you put it, because it is not that simple, explained the Sultan. Each band is loyal only to themselves and to no one else. They distrust all those who dwell in the cities and don't recognize any laws but their own. They sound more like rebels than allies, grunted the lieutenant. Indeed they are, replied the Sultan, but unlike rebels they can be bought. All one needs to do in order to gain their allegiance is to pay their price. They are mercenaries, said the lieutenant. They are the deadliest sellswords to live anywhere outside the city of Sardan, replied the Sultan. How much will it take to buy them? It differs from band to band. Some will take gold, others camels, and still others will take only slaves. Why, I once knew a band leader who would take only blonde-haired Arthurian slave girls as payment. The Sultan sat back and laughed as he recalled the man. Idris Aden had been his name, and he had been the brashest and loudest man that the Sultan had ever known. He had been inexcusably rude and crude, but he had such a charming character and personality that it had been impossible for the Sultan not to like him. Oh, the adventures he that had had with him in his younger days before he had become Sultan. He and Idris had been the terror of the wild dunes. But then the Sultan started to remember the others who had ridden with them, Ilham Osman, Naeem Hussein, Lala Ulaz and Masyaf Baruch. They were all dead now. A shudder passed through the old man as he recalled each of their murders. The Black Bow had taken them all. The Sultan shook off the slow creeping dread he felt whenever he thought of his old friends and rose to his feet, lifting his arms up. I will send word to the nomad bands that I am gathering for a great jihad against the Arthurians and will pay them handsomely for their services, he said as he looked down at the lieutenant. And how long will that take? Asked the lieutenant. As soon as one band is informed, the whole of their barbarous breed will know, replied the Sultan as he stepped down off the white marble dais. He waddled down the carved steps and stood before the lieutenant, who was a head taller than him. Now that the matter of fighting men is settled, as far as the lieutenant was concerned it was far from settled, let us relax and take refreshment. Come, sit with me while the women dance for us. Sample my hookah if you so desire. Whatever you want you shall receive while you are in my palace. The Sultan clapped his chubby hands together and the minstrels instantly began to play, taking up their song right where they had left off. The women jumped up and resumed swaying and convulsing to the rhythm of the music, throwing themselves into the dance with wild abandon. They not only had their Sultan to impress but this Sulian officer as well. The Sultan reclined on the red cushions and motioned for the lieutenant to join him. It was true he had grown to despise the man in the short time that he had known him, but he saw the fire of ambition burning in his eyes when he looked at him. The Sultan remembered seeing those eyes when he had looked at his reflection when he was younger. This officer was destined for power, and the Sultan knew it. It would be much better to win his favor now than spurn him and suffer the consequences down the line. The lieutenant looked down at the Sultan with mild contempt. He sniffed at the idea of relaxing with him. There was too much work to do. Come, will you not sit with me? Asked the Sultan. The lieutenant shook his head and remained silent. Oh, surely you must find time to enjoy yourself, said the Sultan. What is the saying among your kind? All work and no play makes for a dull boy. The lieutenant was watching the dancing girls as he replied, we Sulians believe in strict discipline and orderly behavior. But surely you must relax some of the time, said the Sultan. Only after our duties have been fulfilled, answered the lieutenant, and not before. Oh, come now, young man, said the Sultan, you and your people must enjoy yourselves while you are here in my palace. It is the law of my kingdom that all guests must be treated with the utmost care and respect. Are you going to make me break my own law by not accepting my offer of hospitality? I will accept it when I know for a fact that these nomadic tribes have been informed of your orders to march south, replied the lieutenant. Is that all? Asked the Sultan. Well, in that case, he clapped his hands together and Assad rushed from his place by the wall. The Grand Vizier threw himself down before his master and said, What do you require of me, O most noble lord of the sands? I wish for you to send a message to the southern tribes concerning the jihad that is being organized against the Arthurian rebels, commanded the Sultan. My lord, it pleases me to tell you that the message is as good as sent, replied the Grand Vizier. In actuality, the Sultan had already sent word to the nomads concerning the upcoming war, and this display was solely for the lieutenant's benefit. Very good, said the Sultan as Assad rose to his feet, now be off with you. The Grand Vizier of Kazmourian bowed before his Sultan, backed away and scurried out of the doors. The Sultan looked up at the lieutenant. Satisfied? He asked. The lieutenant snorted through his gas mask. Ah well, sighed the Sultan, to each their own, I suppose. That word you used, the lieutenant suddenly said, jihad, what does it mean? Ah, I forget that you do not speak our language, said the Sultan. In your speech I believe that it would translate to mean holy war. Holy war, echoed the lieutenant. Yes, holy war, to fight in the name of the gods, explained the Sultan. I know what that means, snapped the lieutenant. Really? Asked the Sultan, but I was told that you Sulians have no gods. Our emperors are our gods, growled the lieutenant. What, all of them? Laughed the Sultan, even the empresses. My, what a pantheon you must have. Hold your tongue, little man, ordered the lieutenant. We, Sulians, are a very religious people. We are descended from Sul, the firstborn son among all the races of men. He was perfect and holy while the others were nothing more than animals. Sul raised his children to be the guardians of the world and to teach the other races of men his wisdom and to guide them into the bright future. We know this to be so because we say it is so, and we say it is so because we know it is so. That is why we Sulians are the master race. The guardians of mankind. I see, said the Sultan, not really believing it. No you don't, scoffed the lieutenant. You're right, I do not, the Sultan admitted. Don't worry, said the lieutenant, one day, the entire world will know the truth of the Sulian Empire. We shall see, said the Sultan, looking up at the officer. He had noticed that the lieutenant hadn't taken his eyes off one of his dancing girls during all the time that they had been talking. The girl in question was one of his newer ones, recently purchased from the slave market. She was a member of the Salvik people who lived far to the north and east, beyond the shores of the endless sands. She stood out from the rest of the harem due to her fiery red hair, bright grey eyes, white skin and frail figure. Her outfit, what little there was bright crimson and trimmed in gold thread. The Sultan hadn't yet bothered to memorize her name since she was far too new for that to have happened, but he believed that it was something along the lines of Nadia Slewinski something or other. In truth, he couldn't be bothered to remember it. Salvik names were always so hard to pronounce correctly anyway. But he had to admit that she was indeed beautiful. The Sultan saw, too, that the Sulian was gazing at her with blazing eyes. Do you like her? Asked the Sultan. The lieutenant seemed to be daydreaming as he stared at her. Her bright red hair and graceful frame reminded him of. The Sultan's remark suddenly snapped him back to reality. He cleared his throat and adjusted his officer's cap. She, reminds me of someone I know, he said as he turned to the Sultan. A lover, suggested the old man with a sly twinkle in his red eye. A friend, insisted the lieutenant, just a friend. Ah, I see, smiled the Sultan with a chuckle. How long has it been since you saw her last? Not for some time, answered the lieutenant. Ah, too bad, said the Sultan, I can see that you miss her. Very much, sir, the lieutenant found himself saying before he could stop himself. Well, in that case, said the Sultan as he motioned for the music to stop, since she reminds you so much of your friend, I will give her to you. I'm sorry, what? Said the lieutenant. She is yours, replied the Sultan, motioning for the red-haired slave girl to step forward. She dutifully obeyed her master's command and stood before the Sulian lieutenant. What is your desire, my master? She asked him. The Sulian gaped at her for a few seconds before turning to face the Sultan. Please understand, your majesty, he said, trying to restrain his flustered tone, I neither require the services of a slave girl nor do I desire to have one. Oh nonsense, said the Sultan, she is my gift to you. I am yours, master, said the woman, taking a few steps towards the Sulian. I really can't accept her, insisted the lieutenant. But she is a gift from one friend to another, asserted the Sultan. I live to please you, she said, drawing closer to the lieutenant. We are not friends, growled the lieutenant. But neither are we enemies, said the Sultan, we are allies in our fight against the Arthurian hordes. Allies of convenience, corrected the lieutenant, nothing more. What do you desire of me? Asked the woman, drawing ever closer. Oh come now, the Sultan said to the Sulian, she is eager to please you. I'm sure your friend wouldn't mind. What she doesn't know won't hurt her. As he said this, the slave girl touched the lieutenant's shirt collar and began to undo his buttons. Get your hands off me. The Sulian roared in utter disgust. His hand flew to his holstered sidearm and pulled out the .08 Luger. With it firmly in his grasp, he pistol-whipped the woman across the face with all his might. She fell to the floor with a pained scream, her hand covering her broken and bleeding face. The other members of the harem cried out at seeing this, several of them fainting at the sight of her blood. The Sultan shouted in protest as his bodyguards leveled their spears and drew out their curved swords. The troop of the Sulian Marines, who up until this point had been silently watching the women dancing, readied their rifles and took aim at the Sultan's protectors. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the hissing of the Marines' gas masks and the whimpering of the red-haired slave woman. The lieutenant glared down at her with utter contempt and loathing. She was nothing but a harlot. How dare she try to seduce him? She didn't hold a candle to his beloved. He stopped himself short. The woman he loved above all things, the woman who was so far away from him, wasn't his yet. But she would be all his. Sooner or later he would have her. When that happens it will all be worth it. He looked down at the Sultan and saw that he was completely terrified. He holstered his pistol and crossed his arms over his chest. 3 days, he said in his most commanding tone, you have exactly 3 days to gather your army for the march south. If you do not have enough men by then, I will have the Hilbra open fire on Kaz Morian. Your city and everyone in it will be wiped from the face of the earth. Do I make myself clear, Your Highness? The Sultan gulped heavily as he looked up at the lieutenant. Those eyes. They were practically on fire. They were filled with so much pent-up rage. And if you ever try to snare me with another honeypot again, he growled, I'll blow your fat little head off. Good day, sir. With that he turned on his heels and marched out of the throne room, his troop of Marines following close behind him. The Sultan sat on his padded cushion, his little heart hammering in his chest. He had just been threatened. In his own throne room. If the offender had been anyone else, he would have had the man beheaded on the spot. But he knew that his hands were tied. He could do nothing but obey his Sulian overlords. The sooner that bastard of a lieutenant captured the person or persons that he had come for and left the endless sands forever, the happier he would be. The red-haired woman continued whimpering as she held her bloodied face. The Sultan looked at her and saw the gash that had been torn across the left side of her face, spoiling her good looks. She had been beautiful before, but that wound would leave her with an ugly scar, marking her for the rest of her life. It seemed a pity to have such beauty ruined, but the damage was done and there was only one sensible course of action. The Sultan motioned to his guards to take the woman away. She would be given a small pouch of money and ejected from the palace. Only beautiful women were to be part of the harem, and she was no longer beautiful.